a calm TV discussion suddenly took a sharp turn, leaving the entire studio stunned. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and what begins as a familiar daytime discussion slowly tightens into something more serious, more pointed, and noticeably uncomfortable to watch? That's exactly the atmosphere viewers experienced during this particular segment. And before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The show opened the way it usually does, with the panel settling into their seats, casual smiles, papers stacked neatly on the table, and the studio audience already warmed up from the opening banter. The topic that day had been teased just before the commercial break as another legal conversation tied to a high-profile celebrity name, something the audience had come to expect in recent years. When the cameras came back up, the host introduced the subject with a measured tone, reminding viewers that the discussion centered on Johnny Depp and the broader public conversation surrounding his legal battles, media coverage, and the cultural reaction that followed. Nothing about the introduction suggested tension. If anything, it felt familiar, even routine. Sunny Hostin was the first to lean forward slightly as the topic began. As a former federal prosecutor and one of the panel's legal voices, she often takes the lead in these conversations, and the other hosts visibly deferred to her expertise. She began calmly, explaining the legal framework behind celebrity defamation cases and how public perception can sometimes blur the legal facts. Her delivery was steady, her hands folded on the table, eyes occasionally scanning her notes before looking directly into the camera. The audience listened quietly, offering light applause at one point when she emphasized the importance of evidence over emotion. Another co-host chimed in next, offering a more cultural take, focusing on how celebrity trials become entertainment and how public opinion can shift dramatically in real time. The tone remained conversational, with nods exchanged across the table and polite affirmations. At this stage, Johnny Depp was being discussed as a public figure whose legal situation had sparked widespread debate, not as a guest or direct participant in the room. Everything still felt controlled. The shift began subtly. Sunny returned to the conversation, clarifying a point about accountability and how the legal system doesn't always align with popular narratives. Her wording became more precise, more legalistic, and her tone sharpened just slightly. She emphasized that public sympathy does not equate to legal vindication, a statement that drew a mixed reaction from the audience. Some clapped, others stayed silent, and the camera briefly caught a few audience members exchanging glances. As the discussion continued, another panelist referenced past interviews and public statements made by Johnny Depp outside the courtroom, framing them as part of a broader media strategy. That comment seemed to trigger a visible reaction from Sunny. She straightened in her chair, adjusted her posture, and interjected sooner than she had before. Her interruption wasn't aggressive, but it was firm, signaling a desire to redirect the conversation back to legal principles rather than media impressions. She pointed out that while celebrities have platforms, legal cases are decided on facts, not charisma or popularity. Her voice remained calm, but the pacing of her words slowed, as if she wanted to make sure nothing she said could be misunderstood. At this moment, the energy at the table changed. The hosts were no longer casually exchanging thoughts. They were listening more closely, choosing their words more carefully. One of the hosts pushed back gently, suggesting that public perception still plays a role in how these cases unfold, especially when cameras are involved. Sunny responded immediately, and this was the first moment where viewers could sense a real disagreement forming. She didn't raise her voice, but she did speak over the other host for a brief second before stopping herself. There was a quick pause, an awkward half-smile, and then she continued, acknowledging the interruption while holding her ground. The studio audience reacted with a low murmur, the kind that happens when people sense tension but aren't sure how far it will go. The camera cut briefly to a wide shot of the panel, then back to Sunny as she finished her thought. She emphasized that conflating legal outcomes with public storytelling can be dangerous, especially when discussing serious allegations and real people's lives. At this point, Johnny Depp's name was no longer just part of a general discussion. It had become the focal point of a philosophical divide at the table. One side leaned toward understanding the public's emotional response to his story, while Sunny remained anchored in legal structure and caution. Her facial expression stayed composed, but her jaw tightened slightly, a detail viewers at home often pick up on during live broadcasts. The moderator attempted to steer the conversation forward, summarizing both perspectives and inviting another co-host to weigh in. That co-host tried to strike a middle ground, acknowledging Sunny's legal concerns while also recognizing why audiences feel invested. The effort helped briefly, and the tension eased just enough for the conversation to continue without interruption. Still, the underlying disagreement lingered. Sunny nodded politely as others spoke, but she no longer leaned back comfortably in her chair. Her hands rested firmly on the table, fingers interlaced, signaling that she was still very much engaged and ready to respond if necessary. The audience remained attentive, quieter now than earlier in the segment. As the conversation moved forward, the moderator gently reminded the panel of the limited time left in the segment, a familiar cue on daytime television that usually encourages hosts to tighten their points. But instead of wrapping things up neatly, the reminder seemed to heighten the focus. Viewers could sense that the panelists were choosing carefully which thoughts were worth voicing before the discussion inevitably shifted again. Sunny Hostin re-entered the conversation after a brief pause, this time responding to a comment about public accountability. She acknowledged that celebrity status complicates legal narratives, but she reiterated that the court of law and the court of public opinion operate very differently. Her tone remained composed, but there was a noticeable firmness underneath it, as though she was drawing a line she didn't want crossed. She looked briefly toward the moderator, then back to the co-host who had spoken, signaling that her response was intentional and directed. Another panelist leaned in, elbows resting lightly on the table, and offered a contrasting view. She suggested that televised trials invite public interpretation and that audiences naturally respond to perceived sincerity or vulnerability. Her delivery was measured and conversational, not confrontational, but it clearly differed from Sunny's framing. As she spoke, Sunny listened without interrupting, though her expression shifted slightly. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and waited. When Sunny responded, she did so immediately after the other host finished, without the usual half-second pause that often signals politeness on these panels. She clarified that while emotional responses are human, they can overshadow victims' experiences and legal realities when the focus becomes too personality-driven. The studio audience reacted softly, a mix of murmurs and a few isolated claps. It was the kind of reaction that suggested people were processing, not reacting instinctively. The moderator attempted to smooth the exchange by reframing the question, asking whether the media bears responsibility for how these stories are told. This reframing opened the floor again, and for a moment, the tension eased. One host pointed out that daytime television itself participates in shaping narratives, including their own show. That comment drew light laughter from the audience, a release of energy that briefly softened the atmosphere. Sunny smiled politely at that acknowledgement, but quickly brought the focus back. She noted that responsibility also lies with viewers and commentators to avoid simplifying complex legal cases into heroes and villains. Her voice remained even, but she emphasized certain words more strongly than before. Viewers at home could likely sense that this wasn't just an abstract discussion for her, it was tied to her professional values. As Johnny Depp's name came up again in the context of media interviews and public sympathy, Sunny raised her hand slightly, signaling she wanted to jump in. The moderator noticed and gave her the floor. Sunny then addressed what she saw as a tendency to conflate courtroom outcomes with moral conclusions. She stressed that a verdict doesn't always provide a complete picture of what happened behind closed doors. This was the moment when the disagreement sharpened. A co-host responded by saying that the public often turns to media figures because they want clarity, where the legal system leaves ambiguity. She argued that people look for narratives to make sense of conflicting information. Her tone wasn't dismissive, but it was firm enough to suggest she disagreed with Sunny's emphasis. Sunny replied calmly but directly, stating that seeking clarity should not come at the expense of fairness or factual accuracy. She leaned forward slightly, her shoulders squared, eyes focused on the co-host rather than the camera. It was a subtle shift, but one that viewers could feel. This was no longer about abstract theory. It was a direct exchange of principles. The audience grew noticeably quieter. Studio audiences are often guided by cues to clap or react, but here, they seemed uncertain, aware that the discussion had entered more serious territory. The camera cut briefly to the moderator, who nodded thoughtfully, then back to the panel. The pacing slowed, each sentence landing with more weight. Another host attempted to bridge the gap by acknowledging both perspectives, suggesting that emotional reactions and legal realities can coexist. She spoke gently, hands open, palms slightly upward, a physical gesture often used to de-escalate. Sunny nodded in acknowledgement, but followed up by saying coexistence requires boundaries, especially when discussing allegations that affect real people beyond the celebrity involved. That comment appeared to land differently. The co-host who had previously pushed back shifted in her seat, crossed one leg over the other, and took a breath before responding. She said that audiences also include survivors who see themselves reflected in these stories and feel validated by public support for figures they believe in. Her voice softened slightly as she spoke, and the audience responded with a few murmured affirmations. Sunny listened carefully, then responded in a way that was notably restrained. She acknowledged the emotional reality of viewers, but reiterated that legal discussions on national television must be handled with care. Her tone was calm, but the seriousness was unmistakable. She glanced briefly toward the moderator again, as if aware of the balance between speaking her truth and maintaining the show's rhythm. The moderator stepped in, thanking Sunny for her perspective and noting that these conversations are difficult precisely because they involve overlapping truths. She attempted to transition toward a broader question about how talk shows should handle legal topics responsibly. This intervention helped reset the energy slightly, but the tension hadn't fully dissipated. As the panel continued, Sunny became quieter, choosing her moments more selectively. When she did speak, her comments were concise and pointed, adding clarity rather than expanding the debate. The other hosts adjusted accordingly, leaving more space between responses and avoiding interruptions. It was a subtle shift, but one that seasoned viewers of live television recognize as an unspoken agreement to tread carefully. The audience remained engaged, eyes fixed on the panel, reactions subdued but attentive. There was no dramatic outburst, no raised voices, but the seriousness of the exchange lingered. Viewers at home likely felt that they were witnessing a genuine disagreement rooted in professional values rather than personal conflict. As the segment approached another commercial break, the moderator summarized the discussion, highlighting the importance of thoughtful conversation around high-profile legal cases. She thanked the panel for their honesty and reminded viewers that these topics don't have easy answers. The camera pulled back slightly, capturing the full table as the hosts adjusted their papers and took sips of water. Even as the show cut to commercial, the atmosphere suggested that the conversation wasn't entirely resolved. Sunny sat back in her chair, her expression neutral but reflective. The other hosts exchanged brief glances, some nodding subtly. For viewers, it was clear that what began as a routine legal discussion had evolved into something more layered and tense, setting the stage for what would come next when the cameras returned. When the show returned from commercial, the shift in energy was subtle but noticeable, the kind that regular viewers recognize right away. The hosts were smiling again, posture relaxed just enough to signal a reset, but there was still a seriousness underneath that hadn't been there before the break. The moderator welcomed viewers back and briefly restated the topic, a standard practice that also served as a reminder of where the conversation had paused. The mention of Johnny Depp's name again drew a low ripple from the audience, not applause this time, just acknowledgement. The moderator framed the next portion as a continuation rather than a new angle, noting that conversations around celebrity legal cases often bring out strong opinions, even among professionals. She emphasized that the goal was discussion, not consensus, and that framing seemed deliberate. It set expectations for viewers and for the panel, subtly lowering the pressure to resolve anything definitively. One of the co-hosts began by referencing viewer emails and social media messages that had already started coming in during the live broadcast. She mentioned that many viewers felt torn, expressing empathy for multiple sides of the issue. Her tone was reflective, and as she spoke, Sunny Hostin listened quietly, hands folded again, gaze steady. This was a noticeable contrast from earlier, when Sunny had been more physically engaged in the exchange. The co-host continued, explaining that public reaction to Johnny Depp's legal battles revealed how deeply people invest emotionally in public figures. She spoke about identification, about how audiences project personal experiences onto celebrities. As she spoke, Sunny nodded slightly, signaling agreement with a general observation, even if not with every implication. When Sunny entered the conversation again, she did so with a measured calm that felt intentional. She acknowledged the emotional investment viewers have, but reiterated her earlier point about the responsibility of platforms like daytime talk shows. She said that while emotional reactions are valid, hosts have to be careful not to reinforce simplified narratives that may not reflect legal realities. Her voice was steady, and she spoke directly to the camera for part of her statement, a technique often used to address viewers rather than fellow panelists. The audience responded with polite applause, not enthusiastic but respectful. It was the kind of reaction that suggests appreciation rather than agreement. The camera briefly showed a few audience members nodding, others sitting still, absorbing the point. Another host responded by agreeing in principle but questioned where the line should be drawn. She asked whether avoiding narrative framing altogether might make discussions inaccessible to general audiences. Her question wasn't accusatory, it was genuinely inquisitive. She tilted her head slightly as she spoke, eyebrows raised, inviting dialogue rather than debate. Sunny took a breath before answering, and the pause itself felt significant. She said that accessibility doesn't require oversimplification and that audiences are capable of engaging with complexity when it's presented clearly. She spoke about her experience in law, noting that clarity often comes from acknowledging uncertainty rather than forcing conclusions. Her tone softened slightly here, and the tension that had marked earlier exchanges seemed to ease. The moderator jumped in to affirm that point, adding that part of the show's role is to model respectful disagreement. That comment drew a small but genuine laugh from the audience, breaking the seriousness just enough. The host smiled, and for a moment, the table felt unified again. But the conversation didn't fully move on. Another co-host circled back to Johnny Depp's public image, referencing how interviews and public appearances influence perception. She said that whether intentional or not, those moments shape how viewers interpret legal outcomes. Her tone was careful, but the implication reopened earlier tensions. Sunny responded by clarifying that public image should never substitute for evidence. She was calm, but there was renewed firmness in her delivery. She leaned slightly forward again, signaling engagement. She pointed out that charisma and storytelling can obscure facts, especially in cases involving serious allegations. This time, no one interrupted her. The studio audience remained quiet, attentive. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was focused. In live television, that kind of silence often speaks louder than applause. The camera lingered on Sunny as she finished her point, then cut to the moderator, who nodded thoughtfully. The moderator acknowledged the complexity of what Sunny was saying and asked another host to share her thoughts on how viewers should approach such stories. That host spoke about media literacy, encouraging audiences to consume information critically and from multiple sources. Her tone was educational rather than opinionated, and it seemed to help ground the conversation again. Sunny nodded in agreement, adding a brief comment that reinforced the importance of critical thinking. This time, her contribution was concise, almost deliberately so. It felt like a choice to support rather than steer the conversation. As the discussion continued, the pacing slowed. Hosts waited for each other to finish speaking. Interruptions stopped entirely. Body language across the table became more open, less defensive. The earlier tension hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more reflective. The moderator then posed a broader question about the responsibility of talk shows when covering legal matters involving celebrities. She asked whether the panel felt pressure to balance entertainment with accuracy. This question shifted the focus away from Johnny Depp specifically and toward the nature of the show itself. Each host responded in turn. Some spoke about the challenge of keeping viewers engaged while respecting complexity. Others emphasized transparency and acknowledging when information is incomplete. Sunny's response was brief, but pointed. She said that credibility comes from honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. The audience responded with applause, stronger than before. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sustained. Sunny offered a small smile, not triumphant, just appreciative. The camera caught her briefly exhaling, shoulders relaxing slightly. As the segment moved closer to its end, the moderator summarized the key points again, highlighting the diversity of perspectives at the table. She thanked Sunny specifically for bringing a legal lens to the discussion, a gesture that felt intentional after the earlier tension. Sunny nodded in acknowledgement, meeting the moderator's eyes. The final moments before the next transition were calm. Papers were adjusted, mugs lifted, and the hosts exchanged small smiles. For viewers, the takeaway wasn't about who won the disagreement, but about witnessing a real, unscripted exchange of ideas. It was a reminder that daytime television, when it works, can hold space for disagreement without devolving into spectacle. As the show prepared to move on to the next topic, the lingering impression was one of seriousness and respect. The tension that had built earlier hadn't erupted, but it had been addressed, managed, and transformed in real time. And for many viewers, that made the segment memorable in a way that loud confrontations never are. As the program continued, the sense of calm that had settled over the table didn't mean the conversation had lost its weight. If anything, it felt more deliberate now, as though everyone involved understood they were navigating a topic that required care. The moderator glanced at the clock briefly, then addressed the panel again, noting that while the discussion had broadened, the audience response showed how strongly people felt about the issues raised. That acknowledgement served as a bridge, inviting one final pass through the disagreement without reopening it in a confrontational way. One of the co-hosts spoke about how viewers often expect daytime talk shows to provide emotional clarity, especially when legal cases feel confusing or unresolved. She framed her comment gently, suggesting that part of the show's role is to reflect how people are feeling in real time. As she spoke, Sunny Hostin listened attentively, her posture upright but relaxed, eyes focused on the speaker. There was no sign of impatience now, just concentration. When Sunny responded, she did so with a slightly softer cadence than earlier in the segment. She said she understood that expectation and didn't dismiss it, but she emphasized that emotional clarity should not come at the cost of factual integrity. She explained that legal cases, especially those involving allegations and counter-allegations, rarely offer clean resolutions. Her voice was steady, and she chose her words carefully, as if aware that many viewers might be hearing this perspective for the first time. The audience reacted with a mix of nods and quiet applause. It wasn't the kind of reaction that interrupts a speaker, but it was enough to signal engagement. The camera briefly scanned the audience, catching a few serious expressions, people leaning forward in their seats. Another host followed up by asking Sunny whether she felt that some of the public discourse around Johnny Depp had crossed a line. The question was direct but respectful. There was no edge to it, but it invited a clear answer. Sunny paused for a moment before responding, a pause that felt intentional rather than hesitant. She said that in her view, some discussions had indeed moved away from responsible commentary and into speculation. She stressed that speculation, when amplified on national platforms, can have real consequences. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it was firm. She looked briefly toward the moderator, then back at the co-host, maintaining eye contact. The moderator nodded and thanked her for that perspective, then invited another panelist to weigh in. That panelist acknowledged Sunny's concerns, but pointed out that public conversations often reflect frustration with legal systems that feel inaccessible. She spoke about the gap between legal outcomes and public understanding, suggesting that people fill that gap with narratives because they don't know where else to turn. Sunny listened without interruption. When she responded, she acknowledged that frustration and agreed that legal systems can feel opaque. She said that part of addressing that frustration involves better education and clearer communication, not replacing facts with storytelling. Her delivery was calm, almost instructional, and it seemed to resonate differently than earlier comments. The studio audience responded with a few scattered claps, less intense than before but still present. The overall mood felt thoughtful rather than tense. Even so, the disagreement hadn't vanished. It had simply become more nuanced. As the conversation continued, the moderator steered it toward how these discussions impact viewers at home. She mentioned that many people watching might have personal experiences related to the topics being discussed. That comment shifted the focus slightly, bringing the conversation closer to the audience. Sunny addressed viewers directly again, speaking into the camera. She said that it's okay to feel conflicted when watching high-profile legal cases unfold, and that uncertainty doesn't mean indifference. She encouraged viewers to seek information from reliable sources and to be mindful of how quickly narratives can form. Her tone was reassuring, and it marked a noticeable shift from the earlier tension. One of the co-hosts nodded in agreement and added that disagreement at the table doesn't mean disrespect. She gestured lightly towards Sunny as she spoke, signaling inclusion rather than division. That gesture didn't go unnoticed. Sunny smiled briefly, a small but genuine expression that suggested appreciation. The moderator then acknowledged that the discussion itself had reflected the complexity of the topic. She pointed out that viewers had just watched professionals with different perspectives navigate disagreement live on air. That observation felt almost meta, as though the show was inviting viewers to reflect not just on the topic, but on the process of discussing it. The audience responded with a round of applause, more unified than earlier reactions. It was the kind of applause that signals closure rather than excitement. The panelists relaxed slightly in their chairs, shoulders easing, hands resting more casually on the table. As the segment approached its final moments, the moderator offered a brief summary, reiterating that legal cases involving public figures are rarely straightforward and that responsible conversation requires balance. She thanked each host for contributing, naming Sunny again, and acknowledging her legal expertise. Sunny nodded, her expression neutral but calm. There was a brief exchange of smiles among the hosts, the kind that often happens when a challenging segment concludes successfully. The tension that had been present earlier in the hour was no longer visible. Instead, there was a sense of professional satisfaction, as though everyone recognized they had navigated a difficult conversation without letting it spiral. The camera pulled back slightly, capturing the full table as the moderator transitioned toward the next topic. The audience settled back into their seats, applause fading into attentive silence. For viewers at home, the segment likely stood out not because of any dramatic moment, but because of how visibly real the disagreement had been. It was the kind of exchange that doesn't produce viral clips filled with shouting, but instead leaves an impression through its restraint. Sunny Hostin's role in the discussion had been central, not because she dominated the conversation, but because she consistently anchored it to legal principles. The other hosts, while offering different perspectives, had adjusted in response, creating a dynamic that felt unscripted and genuine. As the show moved on, the lingering sense was that something meaningful had taken place. The disagreement hadn't been resolved in a traditional sense, but it had been explored openly. For a daytime talk show, that kind of moment often resonates more deeply than anything overtly dramatic. And as the cameras stayed rolling, it was clear that this segment would likely continue to be discussed long after the broadcast ended, not because of controversy, but because it reflected the complexities of talking about real legal issues in a public space. As the segment drew to a close and the show transitioned fully into its next topic, there was a noticeable sense of release in the studio. The kind that comes after a serious conversation has been handled carefully, without exploding, but without being brushed aside either. The moderator thanked the audience once more for their attention and acknowledged that discussions like this can be challenging, especially on live television where there's no opportunity to edit for comfort. The audience responded with steady applause, not loud or celebratory, but appreciative. The panelists shifted in their seats, some reaching for their mugs, others straightening their notes. Sunny Hostin sat back slightly, her posture more relaxed than it had been earlier in the segment. Her expression was composed, thoughtful, and neutral. There was no sign of lingering frustration, just the calm that often follows a moment of professional disagreement handled in real time. The other hosts exchanged brief glances and small smiles, the unspoken acknowledgement that the conversation had required effort from everyone at the table. As the show moved forward, the studio audience settled quickly, but the energy in the room had changed. Viewers watching live could likely feel it as well. This wasn't the kind of segment that fades into the background. It stayed with you, not because of raised voices or dramatic interruptions, but because of how visibly real it felt. The disagreement between Sunny Hostin and her co-hosts over the framing of Johnny Depp's legal situation had unfolded gradually, and it ended not with resolution, but with mutual recognition. After the episode aired, that same tone carried into the immediate reaction online. Viewers took to social media to share their thoughts, many commenting on how refreshing it was to see a serious disagreement handled without shouting or personal attacks. Some praised Sunny for maintaining a legal focus and refusing to blur lines between public sympathy and courtroom reality. Others felt the panel as a whole did a good job representing the emotional complexity viewers bring to these stories. There were also viewers who disagreed strongly with Sunny's perspective, but even many of those responses acknowledged her consistency and professionalism. Rather than attacking her personally, much of the discussion centered on whether daytime talk shows should lean more into emotional storytelling or remain cautious when discussing ongoing or past legal cases. That alone marked a shift from the way similar segments are often received. Clips from the segment circulated online, but none were framed as explosive moments. Instead, they were shared with captions highlighting phrases about responsibility, complexity, and public perception. The lack of a single dramatic soundbite meant the conversation didn't go viral in the traditional sense, but it did spark longer threads and more nuanced debate. Viewers quoted Sunny's comments about legal clarity and audience responsibility, while others referenced the co-host's emphasis on emotional connection and accessibility. In the hours following the broadcast, the show itself addressed the segment indirectly through social media posts, emphasizing the importance of respectful dialogue. No corrections or clarifications were issued, suggesting that producers felt confident in how the discussion had been handled. Sunny Hostin did not release a separate statement, nor did any of the other hosts, which is often a sign that what happened on air was considered a healthy exchange rather than a misstep. In the following episode, the topic was not revisited directly, but the moderator briefly mentioned the volume of viewer feedback they had received. She thanked the audience for engaging thoughtfully and reminded viewers that disagreement is part of meaningful conversation. The comment was brief and nonspecific, but viewers who had watched the earlier segment understood exactly what she was referring to. For many longtime viewers, the moment stood out because it felt authentic to what live television is supposed to be. There was no sense that the disagreement had been planned or manufactured. Instead, it unfolded naturally, shaped by the personalities and principles of the people at the table. Sunny Hostin's role in that moment reflected her established position on the show, someone who brings a legal framework to discussions that are often driven by emotion and public opinion. The co-hosts, for their part, demonstrated a willingness to challenge and be challenged without letting the conversation collapse into conflict. Their body language, pacing, and eventual de-escalation showed an awareness of the audience and the responsibility that comes with such a platform. The studio audience, too, played a role, responding not with cheers or boos, but with attentive silence and measured applause. Looking back, the segment didn't end with a clear takeaway about Johnny Depp himself. Instead, it left viewers with something broader, a reflection on how legal cases involving public figures are discussed, consumed, and interpreted. It reminded audiences that these conversations are layered, that legal outcomes and public narratives don't always align, and that thoughtful disagreement can exist without hostility. That's what made the moment linger. Not the names involved, but the way the discussion unfolded. It was a reminder that tension on daytime television doesn't have to mean chaos. Sometimes, it simply means people care enough to speak carefully, listen closely, and hold their ground respectfully. And now we want to hear from you. If you watched the segment, or if you followed similar conversations on daytime talk shows, share your opinion in the comments and let us know where you stand. And don't forget to subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories that walk you through what really happened on live television.